The alarms tore through the corridor before I even opened my eyes, and for one terrible second I did not know where I was, or why the floor was shaking under me like a living thing trying to buck me off its back. My name is Vess, and I am the third engineer aboard a small exploration ship called the Wandering Star, and in that moment I was falling out of a cracked sleeping pod filled with freezing gel, while every warning light in the ceiling turned a furious shade of red. Something had hit us, something big. I hit the floor hard, my legs tangled in loose cables that had shaken free from the wall, and I could hear metal groaning somewhere above me, the sound a hull makes right before it decides whether it wants to keep you alive or not. A voice crackled over the ship intercom, calm in the way that only someone truly terrified forces themselves to sound calm. All crew to stations. We have taken damage on Deck 2. Repeat, damage on Deck 2. This is not a drill. That voice belonged to Ethan, our lead engineer, the only human on this ship who had ever treated me like a person instead of a curiosity from another world. I pulled myself up, ignoring the cold gel dripping down my side, and ran. The corridor outside my quarters was already filling with a thin haze of smoke, and somewhere behind a bent door panel I could hear the hiss of escaping air, the kind of hiss that meant we had a hole in the hull and the vacuum of space was trying to pull all of us out through it. I found Ethan on Deck 2, his hands buried in an open wall panel, sparks jumping around his fingers as he tried to reroute power before the whole section lost life support completely. "Vess," he said without looking up, "grab that sealant gun behind you and spray the edge of that crack before it spreads." I did not ask questions. I grabbed the gun, aimed it at the widening crack in the wall, and pulled the trigger, watching thick silver foam expand and harden across the gap just as another shudder rocked the ship. "What hit us?" I shouted over the noise. "Debris field," Ethan said, gritting his teeth as another wire sparked near his hand. "Except debris fields do not usually hit the same spot 3 times in a row." That should have frightened me more than it did in that moment, because I was too busy trying to keep the wall from opening wider and swallowing both of us into open space. For the next hour, there was no time to think, only time to act. I sealed cracks while Ethan rerouted power. Another crew member named Claire ran between decks carrying oxygen canisters to anyone whose air supply had been cut. A young pilot named Noah stayed strapped into his chair the entire time, fighting to keep the ship steady while whatever was hitting us kept hitting us. When the shaking finally stopped, it did not feel like relief. It felt like the pause before something worse. Ethan slid down against the wall, his uniform soaked through with sweat, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. "We need everyone rested," he said, "because whatever that was, it is not finished with us." That night, my own sleeping quarters were still flooded with freezing gel from the first impact, and the backup pods were being used to treat 2 crew members who had been injured during the chaos. I stood outside my ruined quarters, shivering, too proud to ask for help, when I noticed that the door to Ethan's quarters had been left slightly open. He was still on shift, buried somewhere deep in engineering trying to patch our power grid back together, and his quarters sat empty and warm and quiet in a way that felt almost unreal after the noise of the last few hours. I told myself I would just sit there for a moment to stop shivering. I did not expect his bed to be so soft. It was nothing like the hard foam of my own nest back home. It held my body the way water holds a swimmer, without pressing back, without resisting, and the blanket over it smelled faintly of oil and metal, and something warm underneath that I could not quite name. I only meant to rest my eyes. I woke to the sound of the door sliding open, and Ethan standing there, grease still on his hands, staring at me with an expression I had never learned how to read on a human face before. I scrambled up immediately, apologizing, explaining about the flooded quarters and the shivering and the door being left open. But he only lifted a hand and said, "It is fine. You clearly needed it more than I needed to be right about whose bed it was." He did not order me out. He did not report it. He simply grabbed a spare blanket from a shelf, wrapped it around his shoulders, and sat down in the narrow fold-out chair wedged into the corner of his own room, letting me keep the bed for the rest of the night. I lay there afterward, unable to sleep again, turning his words over and over in my mind. Because where I come from, no one gives up comfort for a stranger without expecting something in return. I did not get much time to think about it further, because before the sun cycle even reset, the alarms tore through the ship again, louder and angrier than before. This time, when I reached the bridge, Noah was gripping the controls so tightly his knuckles had turned pale, and on the main screen ahead of us floated 3 dark shapes, sleek and fast, closing in from behind a nearby asteroid cluster. "Those are not debris," Noah said, his voice tight. "Those are ships." Claire arrived seconds later, breathless, her uniform still stained from patching wounds only hours earlier. "Unregistered vessels," she said, reading data off a side panel. "No signal response. They are ignoring every hailing frequency we send." Ethan burst onto the bridge moments after her, wiping oil from his hands onto his uniform. "They have been shadowing us since the debris field hit," he said. "That was never an accident. Someone wanted us slowed down before this." I felt something cold twist through my chest, a fear sharper than the fear of freezing gel or cracked walls, because this was not an accident of space, this was a plan, and we had walked right into the middle of it. The first ship broke away from the cluster and surged toward us, weapons ports glowing along its hull. "Brace for impact," Noah shouted, throwing the ship into a hard turn that threw all of us sideways against the walls. A blast rocked the hull, throwing sparks across the bridge, and the lights flickered once before steadying again. "Shields at 60%, Claire called out, her voice rising with urgency. "They are not trying to disable us. They are trying to destroy us." Ethan moved fast, dropping into the seat beside Noah, fingers flying across a secondary control panel. "I can reroute auxiliary power into the shields," he said, "but it will drain everything else, including life support on half the ship." "Do it," Noah said without hesitation. The lights dimmed around us as power shifted, and for a moment the ship felt like it was holding its breath along with the rest of us. A second blast hit, then a third, each one shaking the hull harder than the last, and I gripped the edge of a console just to stay upright as red warning lights spread across every screen in sight. "We cannot outrun 3 of them," Claire shouted. "We need a plan that does not involve running." Ethan's eyes narrowed at his screen, scanning something quickly. "There is a narrow gap between the asteroid cluster and that dead moon ahead," he said. "If we can lure them through it, their ships are too wide to follow us at full speed. We slip through, they slow down, we buy ourselves distance." "That gap is barely wide enough for us," Noah said, already pulling the controls toward the coordinates Ethan was pointing at. "It has to be enough," Ethan said. "It is the only path we have." The ship surged forward, weaving between chunks of rock that spun silently in the dark, each one large enough to crush us completely if we clipped it even slightly. Behind us, the 3 enemy ships adjusted course, closing the distance faster than any of us wanted. "They are gaining," Claire said, her voice tight with fear she was clearly trying to hide. I felt my own hearts pounding through both of my chest cavities, a sensation I had never grown used to no matter how many times danger found us. 10 seconds to the gap, Noah said, sweat dripping down the side of his face. The ship shook violently as another blast clipped our rear shields, sending a shower of sparks through the corridor behind the bridge. "Hold together," Ethan muttered under his breath, not to any of us, but to the ship itself, as if speaking to something alive. We shot through the narrow gap between the asteroid field and the dead moon, with barely a body length of space on either side, rock scraping past so close that I could see the texture of its surface through the front window. Behind us, one of the enemy ships tried to follow at full speed and clipped the edge of a large asteroid, spinning wildly off course in a burst of debris. The other 2 ships slowed sharply, unwilling to risk the same fate, giving us the distance we needed. "We are through," Noah said, his voice shaking with relief. For a moment, silence filled the bridge, broken only by the low hum of straining engines and the soft beeping of cooling systems trying to catch up with everything we had just put them through. That silence did not last. "They are regrouping," Claire said, watching a new set of readings scroll across her screen, "and picking up speed again." "How long until they catch us?" Ethan asked. "At this rate, less than 20 minutes, she answered. 20 minutes was not enough time to fix anything properly, but it was enough time to try. Ethan turned to me, his expression sharp with focus. "Vess, I need you back in engineering. If we are going to survive the next attack, we need full shield power restored, not just auxiliary. That means fixing the coolant lines your quarters flooded from earlier tonight." I nodded, pushing aside the exhaustion pulling at my limbs, and ran. The engineering deck was a mess of tangled cables and half-sealed cracks from the first attack, and I worked as fast as my hands could move, splicing wires, resealing valves, coaxing the coolant system back into a working rhythm. Ethan joined me minutes later, sliding under a control panel to reach a section I could not fit into myself, our 4 hands working together faster than either of us could have managed alone. "You did not have to give me your bed last night," I said, unsure why those words came out of me in the middle of such urgent work. "I know," he said, not looking up from the wires in his hands. "I did it anyway." "Why?" I asked, the question I had been holding since the moment I woke up in his quarters. He paused for just a second, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Because you needed it more than I needed to prove a point about ownership," he said. "That is all it ever was." Before I could respond, the ship lurched violently, throwing both of us against the wall as another impact rocked through the hull. "They caught up faster than expected," Claire's voice called out over the intercom, panic edging into her tone for the first time since the crisis began. We scrambled back to our stations, coolant lines only half finished, shield power still not fully restored, and the enemy ships closing in from behind like predators that had finally cornered something exhausted. On the bridge, Noah fought the controls as blast after blast rocked the ship, each impact shaking loose panels and rattling teeth. "Shields at 20%, Claire shouted. "We cannot take another hit like that." Ethan's voice cut through the chaos over the intercom from engineering. "I can push everything we have left into one shield burst, enough to survive one more hit directly, but it will leave us with nothing after that. One shot, that is all we get." "Do it," Noah said, gripping the controls tighter. The ship groaned as power surged through failing systems, lights flickering across every deck, as Ethan funneled every last drop of energy into a single desperate shield. The next blast came seconds later, slamming into our hull with a force that threw sparks across the entire engineering deck, but the shield held, barely, buying us seconds that felt like hours. "We have nothing left," Ethan said, breathing hard. "If they hit us again, we are finished." On the bridge, Noah spotted something on his screen that made his eyes widen. "There is a transport lane just ahead," he said. "If we can reach it, regulated traffic control will flag any unregistered ships trying to follow us through. They will not risk being identified." "That is our only chance," Claire said. The ship surged forward on whatever fumes of power remained, engines straining, hull groaning, every one of us holding our breath as the distance to the transport lane closed slowly, too slowly. Behind us, the enemy ships adjusted course one final time, weapons charging for what would likely be their last and most decisive strike. "Come on," Noah muttered under his breath, pushing the controls forward with everything he had. We crossed into the transport lane just as the enemy ships fired, their shots scattering wide as automated defense drones from the lane's traffic control system activated instantly, locking onto the unregistered vessels and forcing them to break off pursuit or risk direct engagement with a much larger regulated fleet. The three ships peeled away into the dark, vanishing back toward the asteroid field they had come from, leaving us shaking but alive in the sudden quiet of the transport lane. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Claire let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for hours. "We made it," she said quietly. Ethan climbed out from under the control panel in engineering, collapsing back against the wall beside me, both of us covered in sweat and coolant residue, and the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into bones. "You did good work tonight," he said, glancing over at me. "So did you," I answered. For a while, we just sat there, letting the adrenaline drain slowly out of our bodies, listening to the steady hum of a ship that had somehow managed to survive one more night. Later, once repairs were underway and the rest of the crew had finally been given a chance to rest, I found myself standing outside my own quarters again. The flooding finally cleared, my nest restored to its usual shape. I did not go inside right away. Instead, I thought about the strange, quiet kindness of a man who had given up his own comfort without asking for anything back, and how that same man had spent the rest of the night fighting beside me to keep every person on this ship alive, myself included. Where I come from, comfort is something you protect fiercely, something you never hand over freely, especially not to a stranger from another world. Ethan had handed it over anyway, without hesitation, without expecting gratitude, simply because in that moment I needed it more than he did. I did not fully understand it that first night, and I am not certain I fully understand it even now, but somewhere between the flooded quarters and the fight through the asteroid field, something in me had shifted. I no longer looked at humans the way I once did, as strange and unpredictable creatures whose actions made little logical sense. Now I understood, at least a little more, that their strength did not come only from stubbornness or bravery in the face of danger, though they certainly had both in abundance. Their strength came from something quieter, something that let a man give up his own bed to a freezing stranger, and then turn around hours later and give up his own safety to keep that same stranger alive. I finally stepped into my own quarters that night, lay down in my restored nest, and for the first time since arriving on this ship, I did not feel like an outsider drifting among a crew that merely tolerated my presence. I felt, instead, like I had found a place where kindness and courage were simply two sides of the same instinct, one that did not calculate cost before choosing to act. I closed my eyes, Finally warm, finally still, and let sleep take me, grateful in a way I had never quite been grateful before. Somewhere down the hall, I knew Ethan was doing the same, resting at last in a bed that had briefly belonged to someone else, having given up far more that night than he ever mentioned out loud. And for the first time since I had left my homeworld, I understood exactly why humans were spoken about, across every corner of known space, with equal parts caution and quiet, undeniable respect.